There are victories carved in stone. And then there are the ones whispered in disbelief. The kind that leave even hardened generals staring at their maps, wondering if reality has been bent. In the winter of 1945, as the Allies pushed deeper into a dying Reich, an American unit accomplished something that defied every law of war. They took an enemy fortress, not through bombardment, not through siege, but through a silence so complete it frightened the men who witnessed it. No artillery thunder, no screaming charges, just shadows, footsteps, and an enemy who surrendered to ghosts. This is not a tale of fire and steel, but of nerve, of soldiers who understood that the mind could conquer where the gun could not. A fortress built to outlast an empire fell without a single shot being fired, and in its fall, it revealed a truth about fear, deception, and the strange intelligence of war. If stories like these, where courage walks the edge between madness and genius, grip you, then step inside the silence of this fortress. Subscribe, share, and stand with us as we uncover how one of the strangest American victories of the Second World War unfolded. Because not all battles are fought in noise, some are won in the spaces between heartbeats. It rose from the banks of the Rhine like something carved from myth. Festung Ehrenbreitstein, the stone sentinel of the West. For centuries, it had been called unassailable. Its walls thick enough to shrug off cannon fire. Its bastions commanding the high cliffs over Koblenz. In 1945, as the Reich trembled and retreated, it stood as one of the last intact symbols of German defiance. Snow clung to its ramparts like frost on a corpse. Inside, weary Wehrmacht soldiers shuffled through its corridors, boots echoing against cold stone, eyes hollow from too many retreats. Major Gerhard Kruger, commander of the garrison, still believed, or needed to believe, that the fortress could hold. He was 52 years old, a career officer whose faith in Hitler had cracked but not yet collapsed. His uniform was pressed but frayed, the eagle insignia dull from age. In the early mornings, he would walk the battlements alone, staring eastward toward the burning horizon where the front was collapsing. To him, Ehrenbreitstein was not just a fort. It was Germany itself, wounded, proud, encircled, but not yet surrendered. The garrison numbered fewer than 200 men. Some were boys barely out of school, pulled from the Volkssturm. Others were veterans who had fought in France and Russia, too tired to remember what victory once felt like. Ammunition was scarce. Food was scarcer. The radio sputtered erratic messages, promises of reinforcements that never came, orders from phantom divisions that no longer existed. And still, Kruger refused to abandon his post. He had seen what the Americans could do with their artillery, how they flattened entire towns without warning. If Ehrenbreitstein fell, he swore it would not fall quietly. Across the river, concealed by the rolling mists of late February, the Americans watched. The 87th Infantry Division had arrived days earlier, muddy, frost-bitten, and suspicious of the fortress looming above them. Lieutenant Colonel James D. Riley, their commander, studied it through his binoculars from the ruins of a farmhouse. "A fortress like that?" he murmured to his adjutant. "You could waste an entire battalion trying to crack it open. Or," he paused, a small, sharp grin tugging at his mouth, "you could make them believe it's already lost." That was the first seed of what would become one of the quietest victories of the war. At dusk, American scouts crept through the trees, marking positions and counting sentries. They could see flashes of movement in the gun ports, hear the distant shuffle of boots and muffled shouting in German. But there was no organized defense, just exhaustion. The U.S. soldiers whispered to one another, wondering how long such a place could hold if pressed. Some wanted to call in artillery. Others, remembering the massacres of Metz and Aachen, wanted nothing to do with fortress warfare ever again. Riley didn't give the order. Not yet. Instead, he stood in the cold, his breath fogging in the wind, eyes fixed on the fortress. Men don't always surrender to shells, he said quietly. Sometimes they surrender to what they think is coming. Inside the fortress, Major Kruger's adjutant, a thin, nervous lieutenant named Vollmer, found him in his quarters staring at an old photograph of his family. Herr Major, Vollmer said softly, the men are restless. They hear engines across the river at night. They say the Americans are bringing tanks. Kruger set the photo down, his face unreadable. Let them talk. Fear is useful, Lieutenant. It keeps them awake. But if they come with armor, they won't. Kruger's voice was steady, almost serene. They'll come with noise and fire, yes, but we are still the fortress. Let them break their teeth on us. That night, the fortress slept uneasily. The fires of the front flickered across the sky like distant lightning. The men took turns at watch, rifles clutched close, their breath turning to frost. From below came strange sounds. Engines revving, metallic clanks, distant shouts carried by the wind. The Americans were moving, but not attacking. Something in that stillness gnawed at the Germans' nerves. Vollmer found himself staring out through a gun slit toward the river. Across the water, faint glimmers of light moved. Too many to count. Were they headlights? Lanterns? He couldn't tell. He leaned closer, heart hammering. Then he heard it. The low, rhythmic thrum of engines. Not one, not two, dozens. He ran to Kruger's quarters. Herr Major, they're crossing the river. Kruger was already awake, sitting upright at his desk. Calm yourself. The Rhine would freeze over before they try that in the dark. But even as he spoke, the sound grew louder. It wasn't the roar of tanks or the crash of artillery. It was something more haunting. The suggestion of movement too vast to be seen, too coordinated to be real. Down by the riverbank, Lieutenant Colonel Riley stood beside a field radio, listening. His men had strung loudspeakers along the shoreline, their wires vanishing into the trees. From them came the carefully recorded sounds of armored divisions, tank treads grinding, engines revving, shouted commands in English. It was theater. And the fortress was their audience. Riley exhaled slowly, watching as the first snowflakes of the night began to fall. Let them think Patton himself is at their door, he said. We'll give them ghosts instead of guns. Hours passed. No shots were fired. Inside Ehrenbreitstein, men whispered prayers in the dark. Kruger paced the stone halls, his confidence cracking with each echoing sound. The Americans, he thought, must be massing an army. Why else would the ground itself seem to tremble? By dawn, the sounds had stopped. Only silence remained. But silence, in war, is sometimes worse than fire. The men of the fortress awoke to find the river empty, the hills shrouded in fog. No tanks, no infantry, just the quiet. Kruger felt it in his chest. The weight of something unseen pressing down on him. He walked to the parapet and stared into the mist, whispering to himself, "If this is their strategy, God help us all." Behind that mist, Colonel Riley folded his map and smiled faintly. The fortress still stood. But the battle for its mind had already begun. By nightfall, the Rhine was a mirror of black glass. The fog had thickened, swallowing sound, swallowing shape. Somewhere in that gray nothingness, the Americans were preparing their second move. Not with shells or bullets, but with deception sharp enough to slice through steel discipline. They called it psychological warfare, but to the men in the field, it felt more like summoning ghosts. Lieutenant Colonel Riley gathered his small team in a ruined barn on the river's edge. A single lantern flickered over a spread of maps and scribbled notes. No artillery. No charge, he said quietly. We keep them awake. Make them hear what isn't there. His engineers, covered in mud and frost, exchanged uncertain glances. The plan was unorthodox, bordering on absurd. But they had seen what fear could do. At Metz, at the Hurtgen forest, places where entire companies broke under shadows and rumors. Riley intended to weaponize that fear. "Wire it up," he said. All through the night, small teams slipped across the valley, spooling cables through the snow and hanging speakers from trees. They dragged empty oil drums, scrap metal, and wooden planks into positions designed to look like the beginnings of artillery emplacements. From a distance, it would resemble an army on the move. From within the fortress, it would sound like one. The first sounds began just after midnight. A distant thud of engines, the grind of tank treads, voices, dozens of them, shouting through the mist. "Advance the line! Cover fire! Move those guns!" The recordings echoed across the valley, bouncing between the hills. To the German ears inside Ehrenbreitstein, it was indistinguishable from reality. Private Keller, manning one of the northern sentry posts, froze. His gloved hands trembled against his rifle as he stared into the white void. He could hear them. Tanks, trucks, the unmistakable clatter of steel on stone. He leaned toward the next watch post and hissed, "They're coming! I swear it. They're right below us." Lieutenant Vollmer rushed up the stairs, his boots slapping the stone. "Calm down, Keller," he barked, though his own eyes betrayed uncertainty. The noise was relentless, too close, too vast. "It's a trick of the fog," he insisted, though he didn't believe it. Inside the command room, Major Kruger stood before a map of the valley, red circles marking the river crossings. The sound filled the air, muffled, distorted, yet real enough to feel in the bones. He slammed his fist on the table. "They're moving armor," he said. "Get the machine guns ready." "But sir," Vollmer stammered, "the river's too deep for armor. Do you think the Americans care about terrain?" Kruger snapped. "They have the engineers. They have the bridges. They have everything we don't." He stepped to the window slit and peered into the fog. A faint orange glow flickered far below. Then another. He thought they were headlights, advancing columns, crawling toward the fortress. In truth, they were lanterns placed by Riley's men, swaying in the wind like the eyes of something alive. Down in the valley, the Americans watched the performance unfold. Through binoculars, Riley could see flashes of movement along the fortress walls, shadows running, searchlights sweeping the fog. "They're buying it," he whispered. "God help them, they're actually buying it." Sergeant Allen, crouched beside him, grinned. "All this for a few records and a handful of lanterns." Riley didn't smile. "Not just that," he said, for silence afterward. "That's the part that kills." The next morning, the fortress stood untouched. No bombardment, no assault. Yet the men inside looked as though they'd survived one. They had spent the entire night waiting for an attack that never came. Nerves frayed to nothing. When dawn broke, the fog was still there. Thicker, heavier, smothering the world in gray. Inside one of the stone corridors, Keller sat with his back to the wall, eyes hollow. "I heard them," he whispered to no one in particular. They were right outside. Tanks, chains, voices. No one answered him. They all had heard it, too. Major Kruger tried to hold discipline together. He ordered inspections, drills, sentries doubled, rations distributed. But his men moved like sleepwalkers, glancing at the walls as if expecting them to collapse. He felt it, too. A creeping sense that the fortress itself was being surrounded by something unseen. Not an army, but inevitability. At noon, a messenger arrived from the radio room. "Herr Major," he said, saluting stiffly, "we can't raise Koblenz command." "The lines are dead." Kruger's jaw tightened. "Then try again. I want contact before dusk." "Yes, sir." As the day wore on, a strange quiet settled. Even the river seemed to hush. And then, faintly, the sounds began again. Not from outside this time, from within. Somewhere deep in the halls, a door slammed. Metal clanged against stone. Whispers traveled down the corridors, echoing from room to room. The fortress had begun to turn on itself. By nightfall, Kruger found himself pacing in his quarters, his nerves stretched thin. He told himself it was nothing. Echoes, paranoia, exhaustion. But he could feel the weight of the walls pressing inward. The fortress had always been a symbol of strength. Now it felt like a tomb. Outside, Riley watched from his observation post. The fog glowed faintly under the moonlight, and the fortress loomed like a phantom on the hill. "Hold the noise for another hour," he told his engineers. "Then cut everything. I want them to sit in that silence all night." At precisely 2 a.m., the sounds ceased. No engines, no voices, just the wind scraping against stone. The sudden absence felt like a scream that had been smothered mid-breath. In the command room, Kruger stood alone, staring at the dead radio. "Why aren't they attacking?" he muttered. "Why aren't they doing anything?" Vollmer approached carefully. "Maybe they're regrouping, sir. Maybe they're waiting." Kruger's eyes were bloodshot, his voice a whisper. "No, they're watching." He turned toward the narrow window and looked out over the valley. A valley that no longer felt like Germany, but like a graveyard of sound. And somewhere in that endless quiet, he realized that the fortress's strength was now its greatest weakness. The Americans didn't need to break the walls. They only needed to let the silence do it for them. By the third dawn, the snow had begun to melt into thin rivers that ran down the fortress walls, trickling like tears through cracks in the old stone. The air smelled of rust, oil, and something older. Decay, perhaps. The fortress had survived centuries of war, but it had never endured silence like this. No artillery, no planes, no shouting, only the wind whispering through broken doors and the clatter of empty ration tins rolling across the courtyard. Major Kruger stood in the command post staring at a map that no longer mattered. Every red line he'd drawn now ended in emptiness. There were no divisions to reinforce him, no rail lines still intact. What had once been the backbone of the Wehrmacht was now a skeleton collapsing under its own weight. And yet, even in ruin, he couldn't bring himself to surrender. His orders had been clear. Hold at all costs. But what happens when the cost becomes sanity? Outside, the men were losing it by the hour. They moved slower, spoke less, and flinched at every echo. Some claimed to see movement in the fog. Figures in American helmets gliding silently through the mist. One soldier swore he heard a tank's engine purring just beyond the walls. Another swore it was the devil. No one laughed anymore. Lieutenant Vollmer tried to keep order, but even his voice had grown hoarse. He'd stopped shouting commands days ago. Now he only whispered them. In the lower barracks, a young soldier named Weber sat cleaning his rifle for the 10th time, though the oil had long since frozen. His hands shook, not from cold, but from the quiet. "They're toying with us," he murmured to his bunkmate. "They're waiting for us to go mad." His bunkmate didn't answer. He was staring at the door, listening. The fortress was no longer a place of defense. It was a cage. Every footstep echoed too loudly. Every creak of a door made men raise their rifles. The walls that once protected them now amplified every sound, every breath, every fear. Kruger wrote in his logbook, his handwriting trembling. No shelling, no visible enemy, troops restless, morale deteriorating, weather worsening. Then, for the first time, he paused and added a line he'd never written before. Something unnatural about the silence. Across the river, Lieutenant Colonel Riley sat with his staff in a dugout. They'd been listening through field microphones buried near the fortress. The static hissed softly, interrupted only by fragments of German voices echoing in confusion. One of his sergeants chuckled under his breath. "They sound like ghosts themselves now," Riley nodded slowly. "Let it keep working. The human mind does more damage than artillery ever could." That night, he ordered all sounds to stop again. No more recordings. No false engines. Just the void. His men looked puzzled, but they obeyed. As the speakers fell silent, the Rhine Valley became a frozen wasteland of white and gray. Hours later, inside Ehrenbreitstein, the quiet began to consume them. Weber woke to the sound of nothing. No birds, no wind, just his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He lay still, staring up at the ceiling beams. In the corner of the barracks, someone sobbed quietly. Another man began to pray, a low, trembling murmur that filled the room like smoke. By midnight, a fight broke out. A private accused another of desertion, claiming he'd seen him signaling the Americans. Voices rose, boots thudded, fists cracked against bone. Vollmer stormed in, pistol drawn, and fired once into the ceiling. The echo bounced down the stone halls for nearly half a minute. When it finally died, no one spoke again. Kruger heard the shot from his quarters. He didn't even flinch. He simply rubbed his temples and whispered, "Good. At least someone remembers how to fight." But even that hollow defiance faded when he stepped outside and saw his men's faces, hollow eyes, trembling hands, lips cracked from cold and fear. The fog had begun to glow faintly under the moonlight, making every shadow look alive. Some of the men claimed to hear voices whispering in English, calling their names. Vollmer tried to convince them it was the wind. But when the fortress bells began to ring, slowly, by themselves, even he felt his faith slip. No one touched the bells. The ropes were still tied. Yet, the deep metallic sound rolled across the courtyard like a funeral song. Weber fell to his knees, crossing himself. "It's over," he whispered. "They've already taken us." And maybe he was right. Kruger climbed the central tower and looked out across the Rhine. The fog stretched endlessly, lit by the faint fires of distant villages. He could see no movement, no muzzle flashes, nothing, but he felt them. The Americans were out there, watching, waiting, patient as wolves circling a wounded stag. He could almost hear Riley's calm voice across the water. "We don't need to kill you. You'll do it yourselves." Back in the valley, Riley leaned on the hood of a jeep, staring at the fortress through his binoculars. "They won't last another day," he said quietly. "Keep the pressure off. The quieter it gets, the louder their fear will grow." The next morning, when the sun rose blood-red through the fog, a strange sound broke the quiet. Boots running, shouting, confusion. Inside the fortress, a guard had fired at a shadow that wasn't there. Another soldier followed. In seconds, panic spread like wildfire. Kruger ran into the courtyard, roaring for order. "Cease fire! There's no enemy here!" But the men didn't listen. They were firing into mist, into echoes, into their own imagination. The gunfire echoed for only a minute. Then it stopped. Smoke drifted through the courtyard. One man lay dead, shot by his comrade. Kruger stood in the silence that followed, his voice cracking. "You fools! You've done their work for them." He turned toward the fortress gate and saw the fog parting just slightly, as though the valley itself was watching. The siege had never come, and yet the fortress had already fallen. The morning that broke over the Rhine was colorless, a gray so deep it seemed to drain the world of breath itself. The fog had thickened again, swallowing the hills, the river, and the dying fortress perched above them. The men inside had stopped speaking. They moved through the corridors like phantoms, boots dragging across stone, each one lost inside the echo of his own thoughts. Major Kruger stood by the observation slit overlooking the river, his eyes hollow and red. He had not slept. The ink stains on his hands had dried into dark smudges, remnants of his final report that no one would ever read. Below, the mist pulsed faintly with movement. Shapes flickered. He thought he saw figures walking along the water's edge, American scouts, perhaps, but every time he blinked, they vanished. Lieutenant Vollmer entered quietly, removing his cap as if stepping into a tomb. "Herr Major," he said softly, "the men refuse to man the outer posts. They say the Americans are inside the fog itself." Kruger didn't turn. "Inside the fog," he repeated, voice low. "Good. Then they're finally where they belong. In hell with the rest of us." He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward like a dying prayer. "How many rifles still serviceable?" "Perhaps 40, sir. Ammunition for less than an hour's fight." Kruger exhaled through his nose, the smoke mingling with the cold air. "Then we fight for 1 hour, Lieutenant. And when the last bullet is spent, we surrender to no one." Vollmer hesitated. His lips trembled before he found the courage to speak. "Sir, with respect, there's no enemy left to fight." The words struck harder than gunfire. For a long time, Kruger said nothing. The only sound was the low groan of wind moving through the fortress like a dying breath. Finally, he spoke, quieter than before. "That's where you're wrong. The enemy is already here. He's in our heads." Outside, the Americans were preparing their final act. Colonel Riley stood beside a pair of engineers beside the frozen riverbank. "They're breaking," he said. "You can feel it." He looked up toward the fortress, its silhouette faint in the mist. "Let's end it without another shot." The engineers nodded and began their work. They had gathered a small group of German-speaking soldiers and armed them not with rifles, but with megaphones. As the sun struggled to rise, a low voice echoed through the fog. Calm, deliberate, almost soothing. "German soldiers, your war is over. You are surrounded. Lay down your arms. No shame in surrender. The Reich has fallen." The message rolled through the mist like thunder wrapped in velvet. Inside the fortress, the men froze. It was a voice from nowhere. Deep, patient, authoritative. Some swore it came from inside their own minds. Others clutched their rifles tighter, muttering prayers. Kruger's head snapped up. "Turn that off!" he barked. "It's propaganda." But the voice came again, this time closer, clearer. "This is your last chance. Save your lives. Come out with your hands raised. There will be no bombardment if you surrender now." Vollmer turned pale. "Sir, they know we're listening." Kruger slammed his fist against the wall. "They know nothing. They're bluffing." But as he shouted, a tremor of doubt rippled through his voice. One his men could hear. Outside the command post, a young soldier named Weber stumbled into the courtyard, staring into the fog. "They're everywhere," he whispered. "They're calling to us." He dropped his rifle and started walking toward the gate. Another man followed. Then another. Vollmer ran after them. "Get back! That's an order!" But they didn't listen. They walked straight into the fog, their figures vanishing one by one as if swallowed by the air itself. Kruger stepped out onto the parapet and watched. He could hear faint voices now. Laughter, commands, the rustle of boots. But still, no shapes appeared. It was as if the fog itself had become an army. He turned to Vollmer, his face pale and drawn. "They'll never take this fortress," he said quietly. Vollmer's voice cracked. "Then what will you do, sir?" Kruger stared down at the Rhine, its surface glimmering faintly through the mist. "I'll make sure they inherit nothing worth keeping." He gave the order to rig the outer munitions with grenades. But the men no longer obeyed. They had gone silent, standing motionless in the courtyard, eyes fixed on the fog. A strange calm had settled over them. Not defiance, but surrender to inevitability. Then, out of the whiteness, something appeared. A small shape moving slowly up the hill. It was not a tank or a man. It was a flag, white, tied to a broken rifle. For a long time, no one moved. The flag flapped gently in the wind, ghost-like against the gray air. Vollmer looked at Kruger, waiting for an order. The major's jaw clenched, but no words came. His body seemed to deflate, the weight of years, of failure, of history itself pressing down on him. He sank to his knees and whispered, "It's over." Outside, Colonel Riley lowered his binoculars as the pale flag appeared over the ramparts. He said nothing. No cheer, no orders, no triumph. Just a slow exhale of breath. They broke themselves, he murmured. We only watched it happen. The fog began to thin at last, and the great stone fortress of Ehrenbreitstein, which had stood for centuries through empires, kings, and wars, looked smaller than it ever had. The Americans didn't storm its gates. They simply walked up the hill, rifles low, to meet the men who had already surrendered to silence. By the time the fog fully lifted, the fortress no longer looked like a stronghold. It looked like a ruin caught between centuries. The stones were slick with moisture, the banners torn from their poles. Smoke from the soldiers' cook fires mixed with the smell of burnt oil and decay. It was not the aftermath of a battle, but of something quieter and far more haunting. A surrender that had happened in the mind long before it happened on the ground. When the first American scouts entered the gate, they found no resistance. The doors creaked open on their own, pushed by the wind. Inside the courtyard, rifles lay in neat rows, stacked by men who now stood motionless beside them, hollow-eyed and silent. The Germans didn't look defeated. They looked emptied, as though something had drained the life out of them during those long, echoing nights. Colonel Riley stepped through the archway, his boots scraping against the stones. He half expected a trap. But what he saw instead was eerie stillness. Soldiers in faded gray uniforms stood waiting like statues. Some had tears frozen on their faces. One young private clutched a photograph in his hand. A family portrait, the ink smudged by rain. Riley removed his helmet and looked around. No shots fired, he whispered. Not one. Behind him, Sergeant Allen murmured, Feels wrong, sir, like walking into a church after the congregation's gone. They found Major Kruger in the command room, sitting at his desk. His uniform was immaculate, his cap placed neatly beside a pile of papers. He did not look up when the Americans entered. In front of him lay a map of the Rhine, covered in fading pencil marks and notes that no longer mattered. His pistol sat beside it, untouched. Riley stopped a few feet away. Major, he said evenly, the war's over for you. Kruger finally lifted his gaze. His eyes were bloodshot but steady. For me, perhaps, he said in careful English. For Germany, it ended long before you arrived. He gestured to the empty radio behind him. We kept calling for orders, he said. No one answered. Do you know what silence sounds like when you've built your life obeying voices? Riley said nothing. Kruger stood slowly, his knees cracking. You won't understand this. None of you will. We were trained to fight until the last bullet. But no one told us what to do when the world itself stopped speaking back. He extended his sidearm toward Riley. Not in defiance, but in resignation. Riley nodded to his men to take it, then looked the major in the eyes. You did what you were ordered to do, he said. Nothing more. Kruger almost smiled. That's the tragedy of it, isn't it? He said softly. Obedience becomes its own kind of defeat. The Americans escorted the surviving officers into the courtyard. The sun finally broke through the clouds, spilling pale gold over the wet stones. For the first time in days, the men felt warmth, but it only made the scene more surreal. A fortress bathed in sunlight, filled not with the sounds of victory, but with quiet breathing and the faint rustle of surrender. Riley ordered his men to secure the armory, the tunnels, and the outer walls. But as they moved through the labyrinthine corridors, they kept hearing echoes, fragments of German voices that weren't really there, the scrape of boots, the clang of metal. It was as if the fortress itself remembered the sounds that had haunted it and refused to let them go. In one of the lower chambers, an American private found a chalk message scrawled on the wall. Wir warteten, bis die Stille kam. We waited until the silence came. He stared at it for a long moment, then whispered, Guess it did. Outside, as dusk fell, the stars and stripes rose slowly above Ehrenbreitstein. The fabric caught the evening wind, its colors muted by the gray sky. The Americans stood in silence as it unfurled, their faces lit by the last orange glow of sunset. No cheering, no music, just the deep, steady sound of the flag flapping where once the Reich's banner had flown. Riley looked toward the horizon where the Rhine shimmered faintly below. "We didn't take this place," he said quietly to Alan. "They gave it up." Alan nodded, wiping the soot from his face. "Think they ever really knew what they were fighting for?" Riley's gaze lingered on the fortress walls, the centuries of scars carved into the stone. "Maybe once," he said, "but war takes that from everyone eventually." That night, as the Americans settled in, the fortress remained restless. The wind howled through its corridors, carrying whispers that seemed almost human. Some said they could still hear the phantom engines in the valley, the same false sounds that had driven men mad. Others said it was just the Rhine wind playing tricks. But to those who stood watch, there was something undeniable about the place, an unease that clung to the stone, as if the ghosts of the last defenders still lingered, waiting for an order that would never come. Kruger, confined to a small cell, sat awake until dawn. He listened to the same silence he had once feared, and found in it a strange kind of peace. When the guards brought him breakfast, they found his logbook open on the table. The final entry was short. "It was not the enemy that defeated us. It was the echo of our own belief in walls." Outside, the river flowed on, patient, eternal, washing away the noise of empire. The fog drifted once more through the valley, veiling the fortress in pale gray. From a distance, it looked as though it had vanished again, swallowed by the same silence that had broken it. Ehrenbreitstein stood, but it no longer belonged to war. It belonged to memory, a monument not to victory or defeat, but to the strange truth that sometimes the deadliest weapon of all is the quiet that follows when the guns finally stop.